हो बुलेशा हसायार मनाना ते पावे लोग उड़ावण पंडिया
This is the second part of our lectures on early South Asian immigrants to America. In this section, we're going to be focusing on the Punjabi community, specifically in California. And I want to begin by sharing the specific laws that were put in place in California to limit the ability of Asian migrants to settle here, to own land, and to establish families and businesses. Let's start with the land laws. In 1879, the California Constitution was rewritten to limit land ownership to residents of the, quote, white race or of African descent. In 1913, after an influx of Asian migration between 1879 and 1913, California passed the Alien Land Law, which prohibited those ineligible for citizenship, in other words, anyone who was not white or black, from owning land, and furthermore, from even possessing long-term leases. However, 5 years later, in the decision to the case California versus Harada, the Attorney General, Ulysses S. Webb, admitted that this law could not prevent U.S.-born citizens from owning land. In other words, the children of migrants. In 1920, California passed another constitutional amendment prohibiting even short-term leases of land to those identified as illegal aliens. It prohibited stock companies owned by aliens ineligible for citizenship from acquiring agricultural lands. And finally, in 1923, as a response to the California v. Harada decision, another amendment was added which barred the leasing of land and land ownership by U.S.-born children of immigrant parents. The Immigration Act of 1917 extended the Chinese Exclusion Act to an entire Asiatic barred zone. This is a federal act, not just California. The Asiatic barred zone extended from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, from which no persons were allowed to enter the United States. Furthermore, it created a literacy test intended to reduce European immigration. The goal was to prevent quote-unquote undesirables from immigrating to the U.S. Japan was exempted from this ban, as was the Philippines, since it was a U.S. colony at the time. Although not a law, the California State Bureau of Labor Statistics Special Report of 1920 gives us a good sense of how the state of California viewed its hardworking South Asian residents. The Indian, quote, is the most undesirable immigrant in the state. His lack of personal cleanliness, his low morals, and his blind adherence to theories and teachings so entirely repugnant to American principles make him unfit for association with American peoples. Well, you remember learning about Bhagat Singh Thind and his case for citizenship in the United States. As we learned, there was huge fallout from the decision in the Thind case, and 50-plus South Asians who had gained naturalized citizenship lost it. The Oriental Exclusion Act was passed in 1924. It banned most immigration from Asia and hampered Indian immigration. During this period, many Indians, mostly Punjabis, entered the country illegally by going first to Panama and then coming up through Mexico and crossing the border. Before I talk to you about the anti-miscegenation law, the Cable Act, I want to introduce to you one Punjabi woman, one of the few. There were only 100 Punjabi women in California by 1930 who came to California during those early decades. Nand Kaur was the first Sikh woman to settle in Yuba City when she arrived in the U.S. in 1924. She would play a central role in the community's development after immigration for Indian women was loosened in 1946. She would speak publicly in Punjabi and English at the annual Indian Republic Day events in Yuba City, a very big deal for women in general at the time, and specifically Indian women. Now let's look at the Cable Act, which was in existence from 1922 to 1936. In California, the 1872 Civil Code stated that, quote, all marriages of white persons with Negroes, Mongolians, members of the Malay race, or mulattoes are illegal and void. Just to back up a little bit, the term miscegenation means the mixture of two people who are considered to be of different races, and was first used in 1863 at a national level during the Civil War by people who warned that the abolition of slavery would mean large-scale interracial marriage and sexual relations. However, long before this time, states already had policies and laws that prohibited interracial sexual relations. Most of these laws made interracial marriage or relations a felony, and also prohibited the issuance of marriage licenses for interracial couples. In most cases, anti-miscegenation laws were primarily concerned with the quote-unquote mixing of whites and non-whites. Anti-miscegenation amendments were proposed several times in the U.S. Congress, but a federal law against interracial marriage was never enacted. Indian migrants had the lowest proportion of women among all Asian migrant groups. As I had told you, there were just 100 Indian women for 1,572 men in 1930, according to Professor Nicole Ranganath. The 1922 Federal Cable Act allowed women who married foreigners eligible for naturalization to retain their U.S. citizenship, but threatened women who married quote-unquote aliens excluded from naturalization, like South Asian Americans, that they would lose their citizenship upon marriage. Some white women did choose to marry the so-called alien men they loved nonetheless. For example, Marian Kosa chose to marry Dalip Singh Sond in 1928. Bhagat married Vivian Davis in 1931. Both women lost their citizenship because of these marriages. Not being able to bring women from India into California, the men soon realized that Mexican women could be ideal partners for them in many ways. While the courts were often confused about the race of the Punjabi men or the Mexican women, for the most part, the courts and licensing agencies did not really care if an Anglo woman was not involved. Both parties would simply write brown as their race. The first Punjabi-Mexican marriages occurred as early as 1916. That was before the Asiatic Barred Zone was created. These couples would go on to create a new ethnic community, Punjabi-Mexican, who at their peak was 300 to 400 families strong. There was some resistance to these marriages from the Mexican community, who considered the Punjabi men outsiders who were stealing their women. Jordan Villegas shares the story of, quote, a group of Mexican men who abducted two Mexican sisters who had married Punjabi men in the Imperial Valley and forced the women across the border into Mexico, where they were imprisoned for several days and flogged by their captors. In some cases, Villegas notes, Mexican women would connect Punjabi bachelors with relatives still living in Mexico, and some Punjabi men traveled across several states to find partners, occasionally returning home with not only their new brides, but also their sisters, widowed mothers, or other female relatives who sought husbands of their own. The children of these unions were called half and halves and often faced prejudice from both Anglo and Mexican American peers. Most children born into this community were raised in their mother's Catholic faith and spoke Spanish. However, the cooking at home and in restaurants drew from both Punjabi and Mexican traditions. The language used in this new ethnic community drew on traditional food names like roti and curry, but gave them meanings unique to the specific Punjabi-Mexican environment. Curry was used as a catch-all term to describe any dish made with sauce or gravies. all of which have distinct names in South Asia, reports Sonya Chopra. The most sizable enclaves were Yuba City, northeast of San Francisco, Fresno in the Central Valley, and the largest in the Imperial Valley, close to the U.S.-Mexico border. There were also Punjabi-Mexican enclaves in Texas and Arizona. The Mexican women in the Punjabi-Mexican community were central to the establishment of gurdwaras, or Sikh temples, throughout California. The women were involved in cooking the traditional langar, which is food that is served to anyone in the public after each prayer. The Loose Cellar Act granted naturalization rights to Indians and Filipinos. The act also provided for a yearly quota of 100 immigrants from each country. After the enactment of the Loose Cellar Bill, many Punjabi and even some Punjabi-Mexican men went back to India to find brides. Many of the women who would eventually marry Punjabi men and travel back to California with them grew up in middle and upper middle class Punjabi families and had a basic education. Their families sought arranged marriages for their daughters with men from similar class and caste backgrounds. Researcher Nicole says that one of the most poignant themes in interviews she did with these women was their regret at being denied the opportunity to further their education. For the young women, even going to an in-law's home in another part of Punjab seemed like going to a foreign country. Manjeet Kaur, pictured above, was just 15 years old when she was married to a young Punjabi-Mexican man from California. She expresses having an almost out-of-body experience on her wedding day. After hearing about America, the women were very surprised to learn about what life in Yuba City or the other ethnic enclaves was really like. Women emphasized their lack of input in the decision to migrate and the need to adjust their appearance and behavior to fit in the broader social structure, writes Ranganath. Some women found that their husbands were still meeting with their old girlfriends even after bringing a bride home from India. The overwhelming feelings were of disorientation, fear, and loneliness. The women formed very tight bonds amongst themselves, and women who had been in the enclaves longer would welcome new arrivals with tea parties and help them get their lives started. Some of the Punjabi women remember being befriended by Mexican women and Punjabi-Mexican women, and they held deeply profound relationships throughout their lives. However, some Mexican women also remember being pushed out of the gurdwaras once Punjabi women came in larger numbers. Furthermore, changes happened at the gurdwara that were more in line with traditional Punjabi customs, such as not wearing shoes inside and men and women sitting separately, which was not being done in those early decades. After the 1965 Immigration Act, there was a large increase in Punjabi immigration to the U.S. The early pioneer women were central to helping family farm businesses become very successful and incorporating new arrivals into ethnic enclaves. The women also worked in peach and prune canneries. Women played a central role in religious and cultural teachings, and they cooked langar and food for weddings. In 1979, Prem Hunji Turner became the first female attorney from Yuba City. In the 1980s, 5 Sikh women served as the Blessed Ones in the Yuba City Parade. In 1995, Hardial Hunji, a Punjabi Sikh farmer, donated $1.8 million in land and cash to build the Sri Narayan Temple in Yuba City as a monument for his love for his Hindu wife, Kaushalya Devi. Hunji was the first Punjabi pioneer to establish a major public institution dedicated to his wife. In 2017, Preet Didbal became the first Sikh female mayor of Yuba City.